Hello everyone. Let's continue with chapter 9, Reproduction and Development. Once again, I'm Miss Delia, and in this video we're going to continue with 9.2, Human Reproductive System. As I've mentioned in the previous segment of this video, this subtopic is divided into two parts. The first is for the male reproductive system, and the second is for the female reproductive system, which is what we're going to go into today. So we'll go and look at the female reproductive organs, the secondary oocyte, the hormones involved, the formation of the female gamete, and last but not least, we'll look at the female reproductive cycles and its hormonal controls. Here are the learning objectives for this lesson. I hope that by the end of this lesson, you would be able to give an overview of the female reproductive organ and the structure of the secondary oocyte, and on top of that, explain the structure of the secondary oocyte. Then you should be able to explain the role of hormones in the female reproductive cycle, explain the stages of oogenesis, and last but not least, explain the female reproductive cycle and its hormonal controls. We are focusing on the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. Okay, so once again, just a very quick picture or imagery of what our lesson's going to be like. And if you're ready, let's get started. Okay, so first things first, we're going to go for the very obvious thing. We'll talk about the female reproductive system and the female reproductive organ. So what you see in this image here is the human female reproductive system. In most mammals, it's more or less the same. And you would have the vagina down here, the cervix, which is the entrance to the uterus, followed by a fallopian tube on each side and 2 ovaries per person. So in here, the ovary is the female reproductive organ. If you were to get a cross-section of the ovary, this is what you would get. So if you take this, cut it in half, you would see these kinds of structures inside. The ovarian ligament is just something that holds to, kind of connects to the ovary and also supplies it with the nutrients. It has the blood vessels and all that. And when you look inside, you're going to see lots of these little round things. What are they? So these are what will develop and mature into the egg cell, or we can call it ovum, but in this case we more or less focus it as we refer to it as a secondary oocyte. We'll talk about that later. But basically, these are the things that will become the ovum, called primordial follicles. These are primary follicles, which are a bit more mature. These are oocytes, secondary follicles. This is a secondary oocyte that's being ovulated out. This is a corpus luteum, corpus albicans. And as it develops, these more mature follicles will be pushed to this side until it eventually gets popped out during ovulation. But anyways, we'll look at that a little bit later. This is just enough for you to know that this is what the ovary looks like inside. And what is produced from the ovary, like I said, we don't really call it an egg at this point. We like to call it a secondary oocyte. So bila dia baru dikeluarkan daripada ovary, kita jarang panggil dia sebagai ovum. Pada tahap ini, kita masih gelar dia sebagai secondary oocyte. Now, let's have a very more detailed look at what the secondary oocyte looks like. In here, this is just a diagram. Okay, ini diagram lukisan sahaja. This one is under the electron microscope. Ini adalah gambaran di bawah mikroskop. So as you can see here, we have many types of cells. They all look pink, but it's actually different parts of the ovary and also the follicle. So I would just like highlight this part here. This part that I have in yellow is actually part of the flesh in the ovary. Yang saya warnakan kuning di sini, ini adalah sebahagian daripada ovary. So this is the organ itself. Okay? This part here is the layer of mature follicles. So, bila kita punya ovum ataupun oocyte sedang terbentuk di dalam ovary, dia akan dilitupi, dilindungi oleh selapisan sel yang digelar sebagai follicle. Follicles are gonna be promoting the growth of the oocytes and also supply it with hormones and nutrients. Okay, so this layer is called a follicle, a mature follicle. Inside follicle, you have many different types of cells, including granulosa cells. And in here, this part that I have colored in blue is the secondary oocyte. That is, kalau orang biasa akan panggil ini sebagai ovum. Tapi sebab kita belajar bio, jadi kita gelar pada tahap ini dia digelar sebagai secondary oocyte. Okay, so looking at the secondary oocyte, it has the nucleus in there with cytoplasm and plasma membrane. And then there is this like jelly layer called the zona pellucida. Outside of the jelly layer is the corona radiata, also called granulosa cells, but the granulosa cells that are sticking to the zona pellucida. Okay, so let's have a look at that once again. The secondary oocyte can be found in the mature follicle in the ovary. Granulosa cells found inside. The function of granulosa cell is to nourish the developing egg cells. Dia membekalkan zat kepada oocyte yang sedang membentuk. Zona pellucida, like I said, that jelly layer in there, is to initiate the acrosome reaction during fertilization. Fungsi dia adalah untuk memulakan acrosome reaction, proses penghadapan oleh akrosom semasa persenyawaan. And the function of the corona radiata, so the layer of cells that are surrounding the zona pellucida, the function of corona radiata is to supply vital proteins to the cell. So, dia akan membekalkan egg cell ataupun oocyte ini dengan protein yang secukup-cukupnya. Okay, so that is the structure of the secondary oocyte. I hope that you'll be able to label it and at least identify which part is which. All right, so like I've said before, when we're talking about reproduction and development, we are always relating it back to hormones. So in the female reproductive system, we have 5 hormones that are involved. So let's have a look at each of those hormones. The first is something you've already seen before, GnRH, or also called gonadotropin releasing hormone. It is a hormone that is secreted by the hypothalamus, and the function is to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete FSH and LH. Fungsi GnRH adalah untuk bagi tahu anterior pituitary gland untuk hasilkan FSH dan LH. So let's look at the next hormone involved. Oh, look at it. It's FSH, also referred to as follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and the function is to stimulate development of follicle in the ovary. Okay, fungsi dia adalah untuk memberitahu follicle, okay, sekarang masa untuk kita membesar, masa untuk kita menjadi matang. The third hormone that is involved is luteinizing hormone, LH. It is also secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and the function of luteinizing hormone is to stimulate ovulation, to cause ovulation. And another function is to simulate transformation of ruptured Graafian follicle into corpus luteum. The fourth hormone is estrogen. So this is something you know to be a very feminine hormone. Okay, biasa kalau kita cakap perempuan, akan ada banyak estrogen. Okay, this estrogen is secreted by the development of follicle and corpus luteum. So this doesn't come from the brain. This one comes from the ovary. Okay, inside the ovary is the follicle and the corpus luteum. Follicle dan corpus luteum dalam ovary yang menghasilkan estrogen. Estrogen, the function of estrogen is to stimulate development of follicle. Dia akan merangsangkan follicle untuk membesar, menjadi matang. Another function of estrogen is to repair endometrial wall. Endometrial wall ataupun lapisan darah dan sel-sel dan tisu di uterus. So this is the layer of tissues and blood in the uterus. Function of estrogen is to simulate the repair of that tissue and also to simulate the thickening of endometrial wall. So dia akan menyebabkan dinding endometrium semakin menebal to build more tissue in the endometrial wall in the uterus. Last but not least, our fifth hormone in females is progesterone. Progesterone is secreted by the development of the corpus luteum. So this one is also in the ovary. And the function of progesterone is to maintain the thickening of endometrial wall. So bila sudah ada dinding lapisan tisu pada uterus tu dalam endometrium, fungsi progesterone adalah untuk mengekalkan ketebalan tisu di endometrium wall itu. Okay, so moving on. So now let's go and talk about oogenesis, which is the production of secondary oocyte in the ovary. However, before we can go into the process, you need to first understand that oogenesis is not a continuous process. In males, spermatogenesis, once it starts meiosis, it continues until it finishes meiosis 2 and forms 4 spermatozoa. However, in females, oogenesis has its breaks. It's not continuous. Okay? It will begin before birth of the individual, but it will be arrested at prophase 1. Dia akan mula sebelum kita lahir, tapi bila sampai prophase 1, dia berhenti, dia pause. And then it is resumed under hormonal control at puberty. Masa akil balik, ada hormon dia akan sambung, continue, play. And it is only completed if fertilized by sperm. Berlaku persenyawaan oleh sperm, baru kita punya oocyte itu matang sepenuhnya. Okay, baru dia completed oogenesis. If not, then it will just die without completing oogenesis. A bit strange, isn't it? So let's have a look at how oogenesis occurs at each of these 3 stages. We will see how oogenesis starts before we are even born. So before birth, when we are still an embryo, oogenesis begins with the primordial germ cells. First, the primordial germ cells will divide into oogonia. So ini adalah sel yang asas. Dia akan pisah-pisah-pisah dan menjadi oogonia. Kalau satu biji, oogonium. Kalau banyak, oogonia. Okay? And in the 3rd month of your embryonic development, the oogonia will divide by mitosis, forming primary follicle. Masa kita 3 bulan dalam kandungan, okay, it undergoes mitosis and it becomes primary oocyte. And then this primary oocyte, which is still diploid, will undergo meiosis 1 but arrested at prophase 1. So dia akan start meiosis 1 tapi berhenti di prophase 1. That means all females are born with the primary oocytes within small follicles in their ovaries. Masa kita lahir, kita sudah ada banyak primary oocyte dalam follicle dalam ovary kita. Lahir saja, we already have limited number of oocytes and follicles. Next, it's gonna stay like that until we reach puberty. So dia akan duduk saja di sana dalam ovary kita sampailah kita akil balik. Bila kita akil balik, okay, when we reach puberty, the anterior pituitary gland will secrete FSH to simulate the development of follicles in the ovary. FSH from the brain, it's secreted into bloodstream, reaches the ovary. When it reaches the ovary, it simulates development of follicles. So, salah satu daripada primary oocyte dengan follicle ini, salah satu biji dia punya follicle akan membesar. It will grow. So, at each menstrual cycle, usually only one follicle will mature into a Graafian or matured follicle. Dia terima sejak FSH, satu biji sajalah. Primary oocyte dengan follicle dia tu akan membesar, membentuk, perlahan-perlahan dia akan menjadi mature follicle yang besar di bawah ini. Mature follicle ini kita boleh panggil dia sebagai follicle matang, mature follicle, or we can call it the name that the scientists give, okay? Boleh juga gelar sebagai Graafian follicle. Sebab mungkin saintis yang duluan kaji ini, nama dia ada perkataan graph. Okay. So, this mature follicle and the primary oocyte inside, the primary oocyte inside this mature follicle will develop and complete meiosis 1. So, yang di dalam ini dia akan membesar dan siapkan meiosis 1. At this point, unequal cytokinesis will occur. Okay, habis sejak meiosis 1 memang perlu jalankan cytokinesis, tapi masalahnya cytokinesis ini tidak sama rata, tidak sekata. Okay, you will have a smaller first polar body and a larger secondary oocyte. Masa cytokinesis, satu biji kecil, satu biji besar. Yang kecil itu kita gelar sebagai first polar body. It will eventually die. Okay, it will eventually degenerate. It may or may not divide. Kadang-kadang dia akan divide juga, dia akan jadi juga polar body kecil, tapi dia tidak akan dipersenyawakan. Perlahan-perlahan dia akan mati juga. Yang lebih penting adalah ini. The more important one is this, the larger secondary oocyte, which is still contained in the follicles, and it will be arrested or it will stop its process at metaphase 1. So, selepas ni, dia duduk saja begitu sampai metaphase 1. It will continue until just at metaphase 2. And then it will undergo ovulation. Okay, bila dia sudah matang, okay, dia sampai sudah metaphase 2, dia akan tunggu ovulation. Ovulation is when the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary. Bila secondary oocyte itu sudah cukup matang dan sedia, dia akan dipicit keluar daripada ovary. Dan proses pengeluaran secondary oocyte itu adalah ovulation. So here you have an article that shows ovulation taking place during a surgery. Okay, so this is what it looks like in the diagram. Kalau kita cakap pasal bila ovulation berlaku, dia adalah selepas secondary oocyte cukup matang sampai di metaphase 2. Sampai dia di hujung, cukup hormon dia akan dikeluarkan macam ini. It's gonna be released. The follicle is gonna be ruptured. Ruptured maksudnya pecah. Follicle ataupun kantung yang menjaga dia itu pecah. Dan secondary oocyte dikeluarkan. The secondary oocyte is ovulated. And this is the ovulation moment caught on camera that I talked about earlier. It's when a secondary oocyte was filmed emerging from the ovary during an operation. Okay, ngam-ngam masa ni dia sedang buat operation. Ngam-ngam sampai di ovary, ternampak, terjumpa, jadi mereka ambil kesempatan untuk gambar. Okay. So as you can see here, the ovary is kind of like peach or skin color shape. And then the follicle is very red. The egg is yellow. All right, so let's learn a little bit more about that ovulation process. During ovulation, the ruptured follicle in the ovary will develop into corpus luteum. Selepas dia keluarkan secondary oocyte tu, follicle tadi akan berubah menjadi corpus luteum. Corpus luteum just means yellow body. Eventually, the corpus luteum is degenerated if there is no fertilization occur. Kalau tiada persenyawaan, perlahan-perlahan corpus luteum ini akan mati, terurai, dan semasa dia terurai itu kita boleh gelar dia sebagai corpus albicans or just degenerating corpus luteum. And now let us talk about what if that secondary oocyte does complete the meiosis 2. Tadi kita cakap dia berhenti di metaphase 2. Macam mana kalau dia dapat habiskan? Well, for that to happen, you need the fertilization of sperm with the secondary oocyte to complete meiosis 2. After that occurs, you will once again have unequal cytokinesis, where you will produce another smaller second polar body, which will eventually degenerate, and a larger ovum with the sperm head. Maksudnya, kalau kita punya secondary oocyte lengkapkan meiosis 2, semasa itu sperm masuk saja sedikit di dalam itu secondary oocyte, dia terus habiskan metaphase 2, anaphase 2, telophase 2, dan cytokinesis. Semasa cytokinesis, satu kecil, satu besar. Yang besar itu akan ambil sperm head. Yang kecil perlahan-lahan akan mati. Okay, so that is how you can complete oogenesis until meiosis 2. If fertilization occurs, meiosis will complete until here. If fertilization does not occur, eventually the secondary oocyte will die and the corpus luteum will also die. Alright, so once again, these are the stages of oogenesis. Di sini kamu boleh nampak dalam gambar raja ini, dia sudah summarize daripada oogonium, jadi primary oocyte, daripada primary oocyte, dia akan meiosis 1 dan jadi secondary oocyte. Dari secondary oocyte, kalau ada persenyawaan, dia akan meiosis 2 dan lengkap menjadi ovum. After each of the meiosis, you will have polar bodies. This is the diagram in the ovary, what it would look like. You should be able to identify what is a follicle, what is a mature follicle, a ruptured follicle, and corpus luteum. Whew, that was quite a long segment. So that's it for the stages of oogenesis. This is a good time for you to take a break, pause the video, maybe walk around or stretch. And when you're ready, come back with the lesson. Are you ready to continue? Then, let's continue. Now we're going to talk about the female reproductive cycles. Now, I'm sure when you just read this title, when you say female cycles, the first thing you're gonna think about is, oh, perempuan, biasalah datang bulan, begitu. Sebulan sekali, bulan muncul, begitulah. Dia datang haid, segala-gala, okay? So, when we talk about the female reproductive cycle, the menstrual cycle, the periods, that is only part of the cycle. There's also something else happening. As you already know, dia macam tidak datang bulan kan. Jadi lebih kurang 1 bulan, an average of 28 days per cycle. Setiap kitaran untuk wanita, dia adalah lebih kurang 28 hari. But it depends on the person. Some people have shorter, some people have longer, some people have like 35 days. So it depends on each person, but on average, it is 28 days per cycle. And there are 2 hormonally linked cycles that we are going to learn about. The first hormonally linked cycle is the ovarian cycle. It is the cyclic events in the ovaries. Dalam arti kata lain, ovarian cycle adalah merujuk kepada apa yang berlaku dalam ovary. And the second cycle is the menstrual cycle. And this is the changes in the uterus. Menstrual cycle adalah perubahan dalam rahim. So kalau kita cakap pasal datang haid, when we talk about the period or the time of the month, usually we are talking about the menstrual cycle. Okay, so let's learn each of these cycles one by one. I think we would start with the ovarian cycle first. Okay, so the ovarian cycle is divided into 3 phases. The first phase is the follicular phase. It's when the follicle begins to develop. The second cycle, or the second phase of the cycle is ovulation. This is when secondary oocyte from the matured follicle is ready to exit the ovary. And the third phase is the luteal phase. It is the development or degeneration of the corpus luteum. Now let's look at it phase by phase. We will first look at the follicular phase. How does it all begin? The follicular phase starts in the hypothalamus. Kita mula dulu di hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will secrete GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete small amounts of FSH and LH. So as you can see here, di bahagian A, dia ada cakap hypothalamus keluarkan GnRH. Itu akan menyebabkan anterior pituitary gland untuk menghasilkan FSH yang arrow coklat dan LH yang arrow hitam. Okey, bila anterior pituitary keluarkan dua hormon ini, LH dan FSH akan perlahan-lahan naik. So this FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Nama dia follicle stimulating hormone. Jadi apa dia buat? Dia adalah stimulate follicle. Dia akan menggalakkan follicle untuk membesar. Okay, so with more FSH, the follicle becomes bigger and more mature. It will be aided by luteinizing hormone. Dia akan dibantu oleh luteinizing hormone yang arrow hitam. The cells of the growing follicles will start to secrete estrogen, which leads to a slow rise in estrogen. So sambil dia membesar, ini follicle sambil membesar, sambil dia menghasilkan estrogen. Dalam sesetengah buku dia tulis estrogen, sesetengah buku dia tulis estradiol. Actually sebab dia, estrogen ni ada beberapa jenis. Jenis yang dihasilkan oleh follicle adalah estradiol. Tapi masa kamu explain sama orang ataupun masa kamu buat esei, kamu guna mana-mana satu pun boleh. Mungkin lebih mudah untuk kamu guna perkataan estrogen sebab dia macam lebih umum. Okay? Alright, so as the follicles grow, they secrete estrogen. And then what happens? And then in the beginning, the low level of estrogen will inhibit anterior pituitary, keeping the levels of FSH and LH relatively low. Okay, pada mulanya, estrogen level agak rendah. Jadi, dia akan menyebabkan anterior pituitary tidak keluarkan banyak FSH, tidak keluarkan banyak LH. So, ini pun sikit-sikit, ini pun sikit-sikit, tapi itu follicle tetap membesar. Then, as the follicle grows bigger, there will be more estrogen produced. So when there is high level of estrogen, it will stimulate hypothalamus to increase secretion of GnRH. Ini perlahan-lahan naik. Bila estrogen itu cukup banyak, dia bukan suruh anterior pituitary slow-slow. Sebaliknya, bila estrogen cukup banyak, dia akan menggalakkan hypothalamus untuk menghasilkan lebih banyak lagi GnRH. So, the high level of GnRH will stimulate anterior pituitary to produce large amounts of LH. Okay? So, at this point, there will be more and more and more LH. So, when one thing becomes more, another thing also becomes more. That is called positive feedback. So, kita nampak di graf sekarang, estrogen semakin naik, GnRH akan semakin naik, LH semakin naik, itulah LH di sini semakin makin tinggi. And this will result in the final maturation of the follicle. So, semakin banyak hormon-hormon ni, semakin banyak estrogen, semakin banyak luteinizing hormone, semakin matanglah itu follicle. Now, why is the effect of LH greater than FSH at this point? Sebab kalau kita tengok di graf sini, okay, bila kita tengok graf ini, semakin banyak pula ini LH dan kesan dia semakin besar. Disebabkan ada LH, itu follicle semakin matang dan itu estrogen pun semakin banyak. So why? Why is LH suddenly more important? The reason is with the increased estrogen, it will increase GnRH sensitivity of LH releasing cells in pituitary. Maksud ayat pertama ini, dengan meningkatnya kandungan estrogen, dia akan menyebabkan sel di pituitary gland yang menghasilkan luteinizing hormone semakin sensitif kepada GnRH. Sudahlah estrogen itu memperbanyakkan GnRH, estrogen itu juga menyebabkan sel yang mengeluarkan LH semakin peka kepada GnRH. And also, the follicles will respond more strongly to LH because in the follicles in the ovary, there is more LH receptor. Follicle lebih dengar cakap LH sebab di follicle lebih banyak reseptor untuk LH berbanding reseptor untuk FSH. So those are two reasons why you see that the effect of LH is greater than FSH. Alright, so that is it for the first phase of the ovarian cycle. Now the follicles are mature enough. We will move on to the second phase of the ovarian cycle called ovulation. Bila follicle cukup matang, masa untuk keluarkan secondary oocyte. So this very high level of LH, also called an LH surge, will trigger ovulation. Bila LH semakin menaik secara mendadak, dia akan menyebabkan ovulation. The follicle and the adjacent wall of the ovary will rupture, releasing the secondary oocyte into fallopian tube. Maksud ayat kedua ini, follicle dan dinding ovary yang bersebelahan dengan follicle itu akan pecah dan mengeluarkan secondary oocyte ke dalam fallopian tube. Only one secondary oocyte is released each month by one of the ovaries. Setiap bulan, satu secondary oocyte sahaja dikeluarkan dan hanya satu ovary yang akan berfungsi setiap bulan. So, kiri kanan itu dia akan ambil giliran. Bulan ini sebelah kanan, bulan depan sebelah kiri. Okay, so that is it for the ovulation phase. So, while we're here, have a think. Why do some people have non-identical twins? Do you think it has something to do with where the secondary oocytes are coming from? Okay, on that note, I'm going to continue with the third phase of the ovarian cycle. The third phase of the ovarian cycle is called the luteal phase. Luteal phase. So, after ovulation, luteinizing hormone from anterior pituitary will transform the ruptured follicle into corpus luteum. So, hormon arrow hitam ni, LH ini, dia akan menyebabkan ruptured follicle yang sudah pecah ini berubah bentuk menjadi corpus luteum. Corpus luteum, while it's here, it will secrete estrogen and progesterone. So, this yellow thing will produce estrogen, which is blue, and estrogen, which is blue, and progesterone, which is orange. As the estrogen and progesterone levels rise, this combination of hormones will inhibit hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. So, kamu nampak di sini, masa corpus luteum itu ada, dia akan menyebabkan progesterone semakin tinggi, estrogen semakin tinggi, dan selagi progesterone dengan estrogen ini tinggi, dia inhibit hypothalamus. Okay? So, hypothalamus will produce less GnRH. It will also inhibit anterior pituitary. So, it will reduce the secretion of LH and FSH to very low levels. So, this is an example of negative feedback. So, di sini progesterone, estrogen semakin banyak, FSH dan LH semakin sedikit. Why is this negative feedback with the estrogen, progesterone, FSH, and LH so important in the ovarian cycle? The reason is that it is to prevent another egg from maturing when pregnancy may already be underway. Sebab ini baru ovulation, so badan kita mau tunggu dulu sama ada secondary oocyte yang dikeluarkan tadi akan dipersenyawakan atau tidak. Jadi, selagi secondary oocyte itu ada di rahim, kita tidak mau ada follicle lain yang matang dan macam kacau jalan. Okay, so ada satu potential pregnancy kita tidak mau terdouble. So, the negative feedback cycle prevents another follicle from maturing because there is no FSH, no LH. Okay, I hope that part is clear. Let us move on. Okay, so tadi kita cakap badan kita sedang tunggu mana tahu ada persenyawaan, ada baby. Tapi macam mana kalau tiada persenyawaan dan tiada pregnancy? Okay, what will happen if no pregnancy occurs? If no pregnancy occurs, after a few days, the corpus luteum will degenerate because the level of LH is decreased. Okay, dia yang kasih kurang itu LH tadi. So, bila level LH terlalu rendah, tiada orang suruh ini corpus luteum untuk teruskan hidup. Corpus luteum akan mati. Okay, LH level too low, corpus luteum degenerates. The degenerating corpus luteum can no longer secrete estrogen and progesterone, thus triggering sharp decline in concentration of both hormones. Bila itu corpus luteum mati, level of progesterone dengan estrogen akan turun secara mendadak. Then, after all of these are very low, the anterior pituitary gland will begin to secrete enough FSH to stimulate the growth of new follicles and initiating the next ovarian cycle. So, ini yang lama mati. Anterior pituitary teruskan mengeluarkan FSH untuk memulakan kitaran baru. Okay, so that is it for the ovarian cycle. Itulah cerita yang berlaku dalam ovary kita setiap bulan. So that's all talking about this part. Now we're going to move on to the next part and talk about the menstrual cycle. We're talking about stuff that happens in the uterus now. Okay, so this is very closely related to the ovarian cycle. Apa yang berlaku di uterus berkait rapat dengan apa yang berlaku di ovary. Sebab dia menggunakan hormon-hormon yang sama. Alright, so let us go into this part. We talk about the menstrual cycle now. The menstrual cycle also has 3 phases. The first is the menstrual flow phase, which is the rupture of endometrial wall. Inilah masa di mana wanita akan berdarah, datang haid di sini lah. This is your period. The second phase is the proliferative phase, which is regeneration of endometrial wall. Di sini dinding endometrium semakin menebal. And the third phase, secretory phase. Secret means penghasilan sesuatu. It is when you have the thickening and maintenance of the endometrial wall. Di sini dinding endometrium akan semakin menebal dan dijagalah pada masa yang sama. Okay. So, looking at this, we are going to focus on the levels of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, kita tumpukan perhatian kita kepada level estrogen dan progesterone untuk tahu sama ada kita punya endometrium wall semakin menipis ataupun menebal. Let's start. Okay, kind of like fill in the blanks time now. We are going to start our menstrual cycle with the menstrual flow phase. So, ini part yang kita start berdarah. During the menstrual flow phase, the level of estrogen and progesterone in the blood will decrease because corpus luteum is being degenerated. Estrogen, progesterone decreased. It leads to constriction of arteries in the endometrium, thus lower the supply of blood and oxygen. Kurang estrogen, kurang progesterone, saluran darah dalam endometrium wall semakin mengecut. Constriction of arteries. Oleh itu, sebab saluran darah di sini mengecut, sel-sel dalam dinding uterus di dinding endometrium kekurangan darah dan kekurangan oksigen. So, the cells of the endometrium will die and disintegrate. Tiada darah, tiada oksigen, matilah. As it disintegrates, the blood and the endometrial tissue is shed or discharged through menstruation. Disebabkan, lapisan sel-sel dan tisu-tisu ini mati, dia akan dikeluarkan oleh badan kita melalui kitaran haid. Okay, so this is what we know as the period. This is when all the blood comes out. After that, after you're done bleeding out, we continue into the second phase of the menstrual cycle called the proliferative phase. So during the proliferative phase, this is when you have increasing amount of estrogen secreted by growing follicles. Ingat, masa ni follicle di dalam ovary itu sedang mula membesar. Follicle akan keluarkan estrogen. Bila level estrogen semakin meningkat, dinding endometrium akan semakin menebal. Increasing amount of estrogen cause the endometrium to thicken. So here you can see it slowly thickening. And then we go into the third phase of the menstrual cycle. After ovulation, the estrogen and the progesterone secreted by the corpus luteum will simulate continued development and maintenance of endometrial wall. Okay, selepas ovulation, semakin banyak, semakin tinggi kandungan progesterone dengan estrogen, jadi dia akan menyebabkan dinding endometrium terus dijaga dan semakin menebal. The arteries will enlarge and endometrial glands will grow, thus it will increase blood flow. Pada masa yang sama, apa yang menyebabkan dia punya tisu semakin membesar di sini adalah saluran darah semakin membesar. Okay, arteries here will enlarge. More blood comes here, more tissues will continue to live. At this point, the zygote will be ready for implantation. Kalau ada persenyawaan, masa di sini dia sudah bersedia untuk zygote itu melekat. Okey, sampai di sini kita cakap pasal ketiga-tiga fasa dalam menstrual cycle. Sekarang kita tunggu saja. At this point, the body is just waiting. Is there zygote? Is there no zygote? What happens if there is zygote? What happens if there is no zygote? Then we go into the next slide and we start to think. Apa yang terjadi dalam rahim, dalam menstrual cycle, kalau pregnancy tidak berlaku? Apa yang terjadi dalam rahim kalau pregnancy berjaya berlaku? So, let's have a look. If pregnancy does not occur, then the estrogen and the progesterone level will decline, it will decrease, and cause constriction of artery in endometrium. And constriction of artery in endometrium means the tissue will die and then we will have period, which is a new menstrual cycle will begin. But if pregnancy does occur, then the zygote will implant. Okay, zygote akan terbenam dalam endometrium. Pelan-pelan dia akan menjadi placenta. The developing placenta will secrete another hormone called HCG, which will maintain the corpus luteum until the placenta is fully developed. By the time the placenta is fully developed, it will begin to secrete estrogen and progesterone, and corpus luteum will eventually degenerate. Okay, so this is talking about kalau pregnancy tidak berlaku, kalau pregnancy berlaku, macam mana. But don't worry, this stuff about what if pregnancy occurs, we are going to cover more in 9.3. Okay, sekarang kita sepintas lalu sahaja, kita akan tengok dengan detail dalam 9.3. Okay, so we were talking about what happens in the ovary and what happens in the womb. Now we are going to explain by the hormones. Tadi kita cakap begitu saja, sekarang kita fokus kepada apa yang hormon-hormon ini buat pada setiap step. Okay, roles of hormones. First is that the hypothalamus will secrete GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. The GnRH will stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and LH. FSH will stimulate the follicle to grow, and the growing follicle will secrete estrogen. A slow rise in estrogen will cause the repair or thickening of the endometrium. Low level of estrogen will inhibit secretion of FSH and LH, and high levels of estrogen will stimulate the release of GnRH. So this is basically what I was talking about before, but now we are looking at the flow vertically. Kalau tadi kita cakap macam level by level, organ by organ. Sekarang kita tengok kalau satu hormon mula berfungsi, apa kesan dia kepada bahagian seterusnya. Dan di sini kita nampak kita punya flow bermula daripada hypothalamus dengan GnRH kepada anterior pituitary dengan FSH, dari FSH kepada follicle, follicle kepada estrogen, estrogen kepada kita punya dinding endometrium. Pada masa yang sama kita cakap estrogen akan inhibit secretion of FSH and LH. Bila ada banyak estrogen, dia akan menggalakkan penghasilan GnRH. Kalau ada banyak GnRH, it will stimulate anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and more LH. When there is more and more and more LH, it will stimulate ovulation, and after ovulation, LH will stimulate the transformation of ruptured follicle into corpus luteum. Under continuous stimulation by LH, corpus luteum will secrete estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone will stimulate continued development and maintenance of endometrium. So dari tadi kita cakap pasal kalau ada banyak LH, ada ovulation. Selepas ovulation, LH pastikan corpus luteum hidup. Pada masa yang sama, corpus luteum terus menghasilkan estrogen dengan progesterone. More estrogen and more progesterone means more endometrium tissue. After that, the high level of estrogen and progesterone will exert a negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So, bila ada banyak ini estrogen dengan progesterone, dia akan menyebabkan hypothalamus dan anterior pituitary untuk kurangkan kandungan LH dan FSH yang diorang hasilkan. Bila FSH dengan LH semakin turun, corpus luteum mati, menyebabkan kandungan estrogen dengan progesterone semakin menurun. Progesterone dengan estrogen semakin menurun means that endometrium will disintegrate, causing menstruation. So if you are asked to explain the role of hormones in ovarian and menstrual cycle, this is one of the ways you can do it. Okay? Okay, belum habis cerita. After the endometrium tissue disintegrate, the decrease in estrogen and progesterone level will also cause anterior pituitary to secrete enough FSH to stimulate the growth of a new follicle in the ovary. Okay, so ini adalah keseluruhan gambarannya untuk kamu tengok dari mula sampai akhir, dari otak sehingga ke ovary, dari ovary sehingga ke uterus. Okay, so when we're talking about the female reproductive cycle, we talk about all these hormones. We involve both positive and negative feedback mechanism. Mungkin ada yang pernah belajar, mungkin ada yang baru first time dengar. Okay, when we talk about feedback mechanism, ada positif dan negatif. Positive means something increase, it cause something else to also increase. Contoh positive feedback mechanism di sini adalah pada hari ke-12 hingga ke-14 dalam cycle bila kandungan estrogen rendah. Kandungan estrogen rendah. Kandungan estrogen tinggi. Okey, bila kandungan estrogen tinggi, dia akan menyebabkan hypothalamus hasilkan lebih banyak GnRH. Dia akan merangsang anterior pituitary untuk hasilkan lebih banyak LH. So, dia banyak, dia galakkan orang lain untuk banyak. Itu adalah positive feedback. Negative feedback pula, it's when something increase and cause other stuff to decrease. Contoh, bila estrogen dan progesterone meningkat, dia boleh menyebabkan hypothalamus dengan anterior pituitary untuk menurun. So there are some positive feedback mechanism, there are some negative feedback mechanism. So there are 3 diagrams here that more or less show that relationship. Okay, pastikan kamu biasakan diri dengan diagram ini dulu, baru kamu cuba digest diagram-diagram yang 3 ini. Okay, so if you have any problems, any parts you're confused about in this part of the lesson, feel free to ask me. I would like to help you in any way I can. But until you ask me questions or until our next Google Meet, we'll stop here. We'll just have a very quick summary. So rumusan ringkas. In this very long video, we talk about the female reproductive system, where the female reproductive organ is the ovary. Inside the ovary, you will be able to find the secondary oocyte. We talk about the formation of the oocytes, also called oogenesis. So we started from oogonium to primary oocyte to secondary oocyte to fertilization and then fertilized egg. We talked about the hormones that are involved, GnRH, FSH, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, progesterone. We talked about the menstrual and the ovarian cycle, and we looked at that process in this diagram, this very long chart. And we also touched a little bit about the hormonal regulation in menstrual cycle that involves both positive feedback and negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so that is all from me. What should you do now? Now you should be able to make your own notes, focusing on the human reproductive system in 1 A4 page or smaller, and you will put in as much important information as you can. But if you're not able to fit this into 1 page, that's fine too. Kalau tidak muat, mau kasih 2 page, pun boleh juga, tiada masalah. Yang penting nanti saya buka slot di GC, kamu submit di slot di GC. After that, please complete tutorial question, structure question 2, and essay question 1B. And we will discuss this in the next Google Meet. Oh, this is a very long video. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I will see you again soon. Thank you guys. Bye!